Time-lapses are really unique ways to capture a location or landscape by showing how it changes over a long period of time. But thanks to smartphones and the affordability of DSLRs with built-in intervalometers, just about anyone can shoot a time-lapse these days. Well, in this video, I'm going to go over different ways to make your time-lapses stand out, specifically by adding motion. This video is brought to you by Amazing Music Tracks. License hundreds of royalty-free tracks for your videos, films, and more, including the music in this video. Check the description for a link and a 10% off discount. A hyperlapse creates motion by moving your camera through space while recording a time-lapse. It involves taking your camera and moving slightly between each shot in the time-lapse. One of the first time-lapses I shot used this technique. A great way to use a hyperlapse is when shooting a time-lapse of a landmark or large object, by circling the landmark as the time-lapse progresses. This allows the viewer to get a sense of the depth and size of the landmark and its surroundings, while still getting the changing lighting and other characteristics of a time-lapse. Hyperlapses are also relatively popular in music videos. You can pull off crazy stunts like making someone look like they're floating or sliding. Despite the really cool results you can get, hyperlapses are pretty difficult to pull off. They require very precise camera movements to prevent jitter and camera shake in the final product, which generally means you need almost perfectly flat terrain and careful planning and measurements to execute. You can use post-processing to stabilize some minor camera shake, but it's best to give yourself plenty of time and practice before you attempt a hyperlapse. There are also programs like Microsoft Hyperlapse and Instagram Hyperlapse that can help automate some of the work of making a hyperlapse, but you'll generally still get very bad results without the initial work of ensuring smooth and consistent camera movement. Panning is a cheap and easy way to add motion to your time-lapses while still providing great results. Since you don't have to move your camera tripod or rig over the terrain, it can be accomplished pretty much anywhere. If you don't want to buy any additional gear beyond a tripod, you can simply manually pan your camera between each shot. If your tripod head has markings on the pan action, you can use those as a reference to keep the panning consistent. However, if you want to make your life a little easier, there are tons of tools that can automate the panning movement for you, and even guides on how to make your own. I have a cheap one from Movo that only costs $20, although it's basically an egg timer with 2 tripod mounts. It even has a bell. The downside of the cheaper options is that they have a fixed panning speed and direction, but there are more expensive options that give you more flexibility. Panning is a great option for capturing landscapes, especially during the daytime. It becomes a bit harder to pull off a panning motion if you have a fixed point of interest, such as the sun during a sunset or sunrise, but with proper planning, you can pull it off. Automation expands on the pretty simple tools I just described, but it can also get very expensive. Using motorized sliders and tripod heads, you can create very complex and interesting camera movements that are also perfectly smooth. The downside, as I mentioned, is price. Kessler Crane is pretty much the industry standard for this type of equipment, but their options cost upwards of $1,000 for a full kit. You can pull off some incredible stuff, but only if you can afford it. Slider and pan tilt automation is a great way to add interest to essentially any time-lapse under any circumstances. You have practically unlimited ways to move the camera within a small radius. One of my favorite effects using automated systems is to combine time-lapse footage with live action footage. Since you can almost perfectly recreate the same camera movement at different speeds, you can shoot a normal scene and a time-lapse scene with the same camera movement, then use compositing to overlay them together for a particular effect. Of course, you can do that with a normal time-lapse, but doing it with camera movement becomes incredibly challenging without automated equipment. Keyframing a digital zoom is a very easy way to add motion to a time-lapse in post-production. When you're shooting a time-lapse, you're generally taking photos of higher resolution than even 4K video. That means you can zoom into those photos without a noticeable drop in resolution in the final 4K video. With the resolution that my Lumix G7 shoots photos at, I can crop up to about 30% of the image while still maintaining 4K resolution. In fact, if I'm shooting RAW, there's probably enough clarity to zoom in 50% without a noticeable drop in quality in the final compressed 4K image, assuming my final destination is YouTube. If you have a strong focal point in your time-lapse that's also relatively small in the frame, for example, a sun during a sunrise or sunset, zooming is a great way to focus in on it. In addition, when shooting landscapes, zooming out to a wider view can create a pleasing effect. If zooming doesn't really work for your time-lapse, you can also crop in and create a digital pan or tilt. The downside of this approach is that it looks noticeably different from an actual pan or tilt, since the movement has no perspective change or parallax. One last trick to create some visual interest in a time-lapse is to change the focal length by zooming your lens. This works like zooming digitally in that it can focus a viewer's perspective or widen it for a particular effect, although changing the focal length does look much different from digitally zooming. If you don't want to risk messing up the smoothness of your time-lapse by manually zooming between each shot, but you still want to change the focal length, you can also make one quick focal length change to create a cut-in. You can also combine zooming with forward or backward movement to create a push-pull or vertigo effect. This effect can be rather difficult to pull off since, like manually panning or moving the camera, it requires precise and consistent movement. It's also more difficult to stabilize the movement with something like Warp Stabilizer in After Effects since the changing focal length messes with the stabilization algorithm. However, if you do pull it off, you can create some really unique and interesting time lapses. Of course, you can combine any of these effects together to create your own unique movements and effects that are sure to draw a viewer's attention. Anyway, that is it for this video. If you liked this video, if it gave you some ideas about how you can improve your time lapses and make them more visually interesting, hit that like button. If not, feel free to hit the dislike button. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave those in the comment section down below. And if you want to see more videos like this, please hit that subscribe button.